Good morning. Welcome to chapel in Pittman Hall. Bless you, Sharon. Welcome to online guests and in-person guests. So glad you are here. Last night, we held our annual Tulsa Race Massacre lectureship and celebrated the opening of the art exhibition by Anthony Suber. If you missed last night's lecture, I deeply encourage you to watch it on the seminary's YouTube page. It was a stunning lecture and an intentional honoring of the work that continues in Greenwood. For Greenwood, though Black Wall Street was burned, Greenwood is not gone. Lawyer Demario Solomon Simmons described the story of Greenwood as a great love story, a story of a community that was close, that cared for its people regardless of titles or reputation. And that love story is alive in the descendants of Black Wall Street, and it is alive in the work of Tulsans who continue to make community live. So for our chapel service this morning, I invite you into a space of remembering, but also of imagining, creating, and transforming. Confronting our history means problematizing stories that we have come to accept as normal or one-dimensional, and breathing new life into what we do next. Art, music, prayer are all ways that we can accomplish this work, offering space for our minds and our spirits to explore what we accept, what we reject, and what we are called to create. Our worship this morning is inspired in part by the work Seed Cloak by Anthony Suber, which you can see in real life around the corner here in the gallery. We'll hear more about this work from Anthony at the end of our service. It is a time travel piece, a work that calls forth both our collective memory and what is yet to come. So here's the invitation. Worship with us through music provided by Aaron Henderson and Amari Ford. By lifting our voices together in song and through praying by way of Black women's wisdom. Engage with the art, engage with this community, stay for lunch. Let's worship.
Good morning. Our invocation this morning comes from the words of Anjanou Ellis Taylor in her foreword to The Day God Saw Me as Black by D. Danielle Thomas. Will you please join me in prayer? Black God asks, where is your art? Where is your faith with her rings of gold? Black God overthrows King James and puts Prince on the throne. Black God asks, where is your laughter that makes you run when no one's chasing? It asks, where is your community that feeds from its gardens? It questions the place of justice for Sandra, Tamir, Brianna, George, and demands we sit in Salah of what horrors lie in the three-dotted ellipses. Black God demands a fight not for mere freedom, but liberation. Freedom is the white man's folly. Freedom has no morality. Black God demands a getting free that is inextricably tied to community. May it be so. Amen.
A reading from the book of Isaiah, chapter 55, verses 10 through 13. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there until they have watered the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose and succeed in the thing for which I sent it. For you shall go out in joy and be led back in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall burst into song, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle, and it shall be to the Lord for a memorial, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off.
By the great activist, lawyer, and Episcopal priest, Pauli Murray. Will you join me in a posture of prayer? Hope is a crushed stalk between clenched fingers. Hope is a bird's wing broken by a stone. Hope is a word in a tuneless ditty, a word whispered with the wind, a dream of 40 acres and a mule, a cabin of one's own, and a moment to rest. A name and place for one's children and children's children at last. Hope is a song in a weary throat. Give me a song of hope in a world where I can sing it. Give me a song of faith and a people to believe in it Give me a song of kindliness and a country where I can live it. Give me a song of hope and love and a brown girl's heart to hear it. Amen.
an honor to introduce Anthony Suber. Anthony Suber is a Texas-born, multidisciplinary artist based in South Texas. He holds a BFA from the University of Houston and an MFA from Houston Christian University. Suber's practice spans exhibitions, public projects, and multi-layered activations, presented nationally and internationally, including the Museum of Contemporary Art in Thessaloniki, Greece, Project Row Houses, Tenney Contemporary in Nashville, the University Museum at Texas Southern University, Art is Bond Gallery, and the Houston Museum of African American Culture. His solo exhibitions include Redbud Arts Center, LRT Gallery, and Cindy Lisica Gallery, and Nicole Longnecker Gallery in Houston, Texas. In addition to his studio work, Suber is a professor of art at the University of Houston's Catherine G. McGovern College of Arts and serves as the creative director of the Black Men Project, a nonprofit addressing art and mental health. His work has been featured in Arts and Culture Texas, Glass-Steir, the Houston Chronicle, and Free Press Houston. Suber is also represented by Nicole Longnecker Gallery. He was a recipient of the Arcadia Art Prize in 2022 and the BIPOC Arts Network and Fund Award in 2025. Welcome to Phillips.
Why I have this, I have no remarks prepared for today, so I'm just fronting. It's pictures of my daughter. They weren't able to come, so I'll just stick this up here. I'm gonna rely on Brad to tell me when to get off the stage because I can be long-winded, but thank you to Phillips, thank you Dr. Poe, thank you Mom, thank you Brad, thank you Nicole. Nicole was not able to be with us this morning, but I'm really appreciative of this opportunity, and thank you all who are tuning in online, who are here for the talk and discussion. The seed cloak, okay. So this piece I feel like I'm really fortunate to have been the author of for various reasons. To really talk about this piece, though, I think I have to do a little bit of time traveling. I think I talked about time traveling last night when I was upstairs talking about the remainder of the work that's in the exhibition. To me, and this is a theory and a concept that I've been working on for quite some time, and this I feel like aligns with my church tradition. I grew up in a Baptist church and later moved to a non-denominational church, and at that time I was really interested in how spirituality, scripture, antiquity, and belief systems, specifically in terms of the African diaspora, how those things collide and coalesce and really relate to my ancestors, which is, I'd say 99% of the breadth of my work is really dealing with celebrating, venerating, and remembering my ancestors. And I feel like the older that I get, I'm a father of two children, one girl who's in high school, she's an artist, and one young lady who is in middle school, and you know, we have conversations in my home all the time about honoring your ancestors. And I really credit that to my mom's mom, Hattie Connor, who was an unofficial historian. I mentioned last night that our family has property in East Texas and Crockett. If you've been to Texas, Crockett is like 10 minutes, about 10 minutes, you're out of it, you're in and out. If that long, you know. However, they were able to, my ancestors that lived in that part of Texas, they were able to purchase land in the late 1860s after slavery, emancipation, and during the time when blacks were trying to really establish themselves and also create areas of liberation, spaces where they could feel safe. Along with that, I feel like the story gets extended into honoring traditions and really venerating the ones that came before them and made that possible. And so East Texas was an anchor for me. Many of the stories that I heard growing up came from my grandmother. And at the time, admittedly, I didn't cherish those stories. I was a kid, but she would yearly take us on a pilgrimage to that part of Texas. I was not unfamiliar with that part of Texas, and I'm really thankful for it because as I've become an adult and a father myself, I understand the power and the liberation that comes with understanding one's own history. But to really understand that, you have to understand both the dirty and the clean sides of that history, the parts that aren't so beautiful and the parts that aren't so pretty. So anyway, going back to the seed cloak and my connection to East Texas, I feel that when I heard this story, this was not a story passed down from my grandmother, but to me it resonated with East Texas lore and the way that African Americans really had to fend for themselves, you know, in light of lack of support and also being marginalized for centuries, you know. And so I was talking to a friend of mine, and I can't remember actually when this was, but we had a really beautiful discussion about the transatlantic slave trade and how enslaved Africans were pretty much abducted. And we had this really beautiful discussion about hegemony and the fact that erasure was a part of their journey, right? They had to be pulled from their families, right? That's the most destructive way, but also the most effective way to erase someone's history is just to steal them outright and deny them access to what they may have had access to for centuries, right? What a traumatic thing to experience. But as we were talking about this journey for these enslaved Africans, it was mentioned about the enslaved Africans actually putting seeds in their braids to carry them with them, and sometimes kind of stuck in whatever garments they may have had. And of course, you know, if we study history and we look at what became of those crops and those seeds, we probably can trace a lot of the cuisine, a lot of the things that we use today back to those original ancestors' seeds. And so I thought it was a beautiful image, as I said before, this idea of suffering and pain, and the idea that beauty can be within that capsule of suffering and pain, and you can find beauty. I thought about this seed arc, the concept of a seed arc. And I have to admit, so this is my second attempt at actually realizing what's in my brain for this piece. The actual piece itself actually does include a boat, which I could not get into that gallery in the front. I'm sure y'all are thankful for me not trying to do that. At some point, I'll get around to making an iteration of that. And I'll talk about, there's another piece called The Perpetual Bloom that's upstairs. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go see it because it's a response piece to the Sea Cloak. But going back to the lore and the way that I designed this piece, and I hope that you guys can follow me because sometimes I get off into my own brain. I have an active imagination, as you probably can guess. But what I envision, I'm a fan of sci-fi. I'm a huge fan of lore and fiction. I read Octavia Butler. If you haven't gotten a chance to read any of her novels, you should definitely read them. There's a lot of history and beautiful motifs in those books. I just read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Water Dancer, which was also a connecting point for me making this piece. And N.K. Jemisin is, you know, also a supreme artist that writes a lot about our stories and creates, you know, these beautiful motifs and worlds by using fiction. But when I envisioned this piece, I thought about a traveler, not only traveling through time, but transcending the galaxy and using a vessel that could carry seeds from one place to another. I just finished up Parable of the Seed by Octavia Butler, and she described, one of the main characters in the book describes the seed as the investment of the past into the future, which I thought was really beautiful. I'm paraphrasing, but it was a really beautiful notion. And the main character is a daughter of a Baptist minister. This is a post-apocalyptic book. But what I really thought was beautiful in that story and what relates to this idea of the sea cloak, we're going to talk about the various kind of modalities of the cloak in a second. But what I thought was really beautiful and connected to this particular piece was this idea of liberation not looking the same every time. You know, sometimes we have to do different things, and sometimes we have to really activate the imagination and go beyond. And so when I was reading that book and I saw the character really relating to this idea of freedom not necessarily being terrestrial, but something that could be intergalactic, to me that reminded me of God, right? like this idea like God is much bigger, he's grander, she is grander, you know, than what we imagine. And so for me, that's the galaxy, that's the cosmos. Um, and so this vestment is an intergalactic travel device. And if you notice the pockets on each kind of panel of the cloak, it's holding either a seed or a packet of seeds, but there's also growth coming out of those pockets. And each one of the layers also represents like a travel into a different dimension or a different galaxy. And so what I envision for this particular travel is that every time they visit a different space of liberation, a different layer gets added onto the cloak. This version of it is actually smaller than what you guys have here at Phillips. But as I have imagined this, I imagine also the idea of time travel being represented by residue. And for me, this idea of laying seeds, walking into ecotones. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of ecotone, but it's the space that exists between waterways and the dry land. And generally, when you're talking about nature, that's the place where most nutrients are held. Also, there are seeds and there's growth and life there. And so as I imagine this traveler walking through this ecotone and collecting seeds, collecting residue from ancestors and taking it from place to place. The other really beautiful thing about this is the inside of it. So I actually built a lot of these layers, but I was fortunate enough to work with a very talented designer by the name of Heather Boudreau, who helped me to realize all this. I couldn't do all this by myself, y'all. I don't know how to sew like that. I wish I did. But one of the beautiful things about that process was that I was able to make this design and pretty much have it land the way that I would have intended. If I tried to make this, it wouldn't have looked nearly that good. But she and I worked for almost a year on the concept of it and then actually realizing the piece. And so along that journey, there were some opportunities for me to embed history in this piece. And so I would invite you, when you go into the gallery to look at the piece, don't go inside the grass, but if you can peer on the inside, you can notice in this picture, the arm is actually raised as a welcoming gesture to any comers, anyone who wants to take this journey with the voyager, the person who is traveling in this seed cloak. But then on the inside, I actually custom made the fabric, and it has hand-printed fabric that has a scarab beetle, which is an insect that represents protection. It also is a nod to antiquity. I went to Egypt in my 20s, and I was just blown away by the history and the connection that they have to the African diaspora. And so my mother calls this piece, I'm gonna put you on the spot for a second. My mother calls this piece Darth Vader for some reason. And I guess it kind of does look like Vader. It kind of looks like Vader, but I'll say this is Darth Vader's well-meaning cousin, Light Vader. Yeah, I don't know, even though it's Darth. But another beautiful kind of element in this piece also is this idea of capturing history, which is, as I kind of began this talk, I talked about my grandmother. And, after she passed away, a lot of the stories that she told me and the things that she was able to connect for our family really resonated with me. And so I began to write a lore called the AFAM. And the AFAM is short for African American, but it's a tribe of fictitious Maroons. If you know the history of the Maroons, there were Maroons all over the United States and probably in different parts of the world for the diaspora. But Maroons were disbanded, either enslaved or free men. They were able to basically go in the wilderness and live on their own. They had their own culture. They had I don't know if the Gullah, somebody could correct me. I know there's historians somewhere out there, but the Gullah Geechee, I believe there are parts of that region that Maroons lived in. And so that's where you see that untainted history of the enslaved Africans, or the Africans that came to the United States, came to this continent. But it's a beautiful manifestation of, again, what we talk about when we talk about freedom and what it can look like for different people. They were not free because they couldn't just roam about. However, they figured out ways through the use of technology, through a veneration for the nature around them and worship of God, to create what freedom should look like for themselves. And so these AFAM figures are a part of this Maroon culture. And and this is where I kind of deviated into the Black Panther thing last night, they have developed technology for their uses of camouflage, for the uses of travel. And I'll make a note also, shameless plug of my film upstairs. That film is a version of what I envision a time traveler to look like. and also this idea of landing in different moments for the purpose of studying history in order to not repeat the horrible parts of history. Um, in relation to the seed cloak, the perpetual bloom piece, so if you notice, I don't know if you've noticed, but this piece is actually a male figure. It's actually designed on my proportions. And when I envisioned this piece, I actually envisioned an entire family of wearers, of intergalactic travelers, wearing these cloaks and different vestments. The cloak that's upstairs is actually the female version of this piece and is in direct connection. However, the difference between this piece and the one that's featured upstairs is that the one upstairs is a direct response to the history of Tulsa. And so what I envisioned with that particular piece, I don't have an image for you guys to see, but what I envisioned for that piece was what happens once the history is learned and we take corrective posture and corrective measures to make sure that that history doesn't repeat itself. And so one thing you'll notice is that both of these pieces are venerations of plant life, God's creations, but they also are vestments and they carry things with them. Both pieces also feature, and this is a vehicle that I've used throughout my drawings and my paintings, these suitcases, which in my imagination of the FM lore, this is the thing that makes the time travel essential, is the case. I began using suitcases about 2 or 3 years ago as a symbolic element that, to me, it represents the way that we carry important things with us. Oftentimes when we have to escape and go to places in a hurry, we have enough room for one suitcase. And I thought that was an appropriate symbolic element that really connected the idea of humanity and what it takes to find liberation. Sometimes you have to travel lightly. There was another point I was going to make about that suitcase, and I just forgot. It slipped my mind. Y'all got to forgive me. I'm 46, and my brain sometimes doesn't work all the way. But yeah, one of the adventurous kind of things that I get to do as an artist is really use my imagination. And, I really want to kind of implore you all, those who are listening, those who are here, those who are online, that creativity and imagination is the way of liberation. That was one of the reasons why when Brian Ellison, who's a native Tilson, asked me to become a part of the Black Man Project, I said yes, because the idea of using creativity, using our imagination, even in the written word, or the musicians sharing beautiful pieces with us, those are what liberation looks like. It's also the way that we capture history. It's the way that we layer ourselves and we hide those things. Those are the things that people can't steal from us. It's all within our spirit and our souls, and those are the things that we have to lean upon in order to find liberation. I'm saying that also because I'm trying to figure out what I was going to say about that sea cloak. But yeah, I'm really fortunate to have this opportunity with y'all. I really appreciate you inviting me to be a part of this. And I'm here for questions. I love to answer questions, so I don't know how much time we have, but I'm also open to answering any questions anyone has about the actual sea cloak. Would anybody like to throw me a question while I'm up here? I know I'm kind of throwing y'all a curveball, but yes, ma'am. The cowl. Thank you for asking about that. Yes, yes. So the cowl is inspired by sacred geometry, which is something that I use quite a bit in my work. If you're not familiar with sacred geometry, it's a kind of a mathematical universal translator. You see Fibonacci sequence or even the quilt codes, which is something that's been utilized a lot, I'll say, in my recent work. I don't know if y'all familiar with the quilt codes, but they were a system of communication designed by enslaved individuals in order to communicate to one another safe passage, or this is a place you can stay, or these people are good, or whatever the case may be. And I believe there's like some 20 to 30 quilt codes. My wife would have to correct me on that because she's doing some work right around there right now. But the helmet is actually, if you look at it, it has a lot of geometric cuts. But I will say the framework of it actually, and the sculpture is not here, was designed maybe about 10 years ago. I did a piece called Mother Africa, which is also related to that drawing. But the figure was wearing a headpiece, a crown that had that exact shape. And that piece I designed on the headdresses that ancient African royalty, and royalty and Egyptian royalty would wear as a sign of their regalness. Yeah. Thank you. I absolutely did. Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned the book, The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so the motif of that book is that water was the way in which we traveled from one place to another. And the activation element would be singing Negro hymns and spirituals, which we know was an element of the Underground Railroad. But what the book discusses is that song and that frequency, which is in Sebo Campbell's Sky Full of Elephants, actually activates the water. And so, and it opens it up. And so, kind of like parting the sea for Moses, this is how people got their safe travel according to that book. But yes, to your point, it was inspired very much by Harriet Tubman. When you see images of Harriet, she often was carrying, cargo with her, often a pistol for protection. And you got to have that protection every once in a while. But I would assume also she probably had food rations with her. She had various things that she would need for the journey, but it was on her person, right? And so, yeah, it very, very much was inspired by not only Harriet Tubman, but all the conductors of the Underground Railroad. Yeah. Any other questions? Man, I thought y'all were just going to jump all over this. Did you have a question? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Tell me about, or can you speak to if you don't mind? On the periphery there is a little guy or anteater looking sort of object.
Okay.
What's the relevance?
Yeah,
of
that's
that?
Pantalone. Yes. Okay, so if you know La Comedia, I think is the name of it, is a series of written tales that they're talking about virtues of greed or avarice or whatever the case may be. And my daughter, who is in school for musical theater, came home one day really excited about that, and I was actually working on the Unk piece. The figure, Pantalone in the back, is the personification of greed. He's also the personification of what degradation looks like. And so I actually took the concept of Pantalone. I basically just took his nose and everything, and I redesigned it with more kind of African features and made him kind of the personification of what it looks like for a person of color to have been an agent in the process of greed or taking away opportunities from others. Yeah, that's a great question. You're like the only person who knows that. I will say this also. So the seed cloak is actually featured in the Illusions of Home piece upstairs also. So if you get a chance to check out that piece, it is one of the pieces that has the arched top. If you look towards the bottom, there's actually a visual of the seed cloak actually walking through this scene. I'm also going to give y'all a term to go home with also. And if you don't write it down and I give you a quiz, you're going to fail. So you should write it down. But the lens, I'm with what we were talking about last night with the lack of labels. We don't necessarily need labels to make things important. However, I do think in the aspect of art, sometimes it's important to understand where an artist is coming from or what their visual lineage is. And one of the favorite things that I like to do with my first year students is ask them, who are your artistic ancestors? And for me, my artistic ancestors were John Biggers, Charles White, Floyd Newsom, who was one of my mentors, who was also one of the founders of Project Row Houses. Guys like that were individuals that I saw this use of history, but using it in an Afrofuturistic way. So that's the term I want y'all to stick with. And so when I mentioned Black Panther, Octavia Butler, these are writers and artists that are working in Afrofuturism. Now, there's a subcategory of it called Afro-Surrealism. Not a lot of people are writing about that right now. Maybe one day I'll get somebody to write a book about it or something. But Afro-Surrealism, and this is the tricky part, if you know about the Surrealist and what they were trying to do, just the Surrealist in general and what the recognized Surrealist movement, it wasn't just the idea of dreamlike imagery and imagination. There was also a political spin to it. They were using those images and they were using that language and they were using those visuals to disarm the audiences and using the idea of absurdity, things that you would never imagine to really address the problems that were happening right here. The Afro-Surrealists are doing the same thing, but the difference is it's a focus on the diaspora. And so that's the lens in which, if you ever talk about my work or you talk about an artist like some of the ones I mentioned, they're Afrofuturist or Afro-Surrealist. You have another question?
Can you talk a little bit about your work? Well, no. Can you talk a little bit about the field that you're in, notions of translation,
Okay.
both like intracommunal translation, people that are in art, out of art. What goes through your mind when you're developing pieces like this in terms of you're translating these images, right, and articulating these powerful messages and engage in like critical readings of discourse and literature and tradition and history? Where are you? Where does the notion of your translation and being translated, right?
Sure.
In terms of like different audiences, you talked a lot about over the last day or so about the different types of venues there that you're, you know, whether it be at a museum or or in a public park. So can you talk a little bit about translation? Because that
Sure.
also ends up being helpful for non-artists that are engaged in the type of articulation of the divine and the prophetic proclamation. And so
Sure.
I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that.
no, that's a great question, and I think that'll allow me to kind of get a little bit more personal also. So, this is a word that I just learned because I was invited to be on a panel of artists that work in autoethnography, which is something I didn't know I've been doing my entire life. But it's the lens of using obviously your own story to address the issues of race or color or whatever the case may be, or talk about the differences that culture brings. And so with me, I use that as a lens I hope I'm answering your question, but to me, I use as the excuse, maybe I've given myself permission, because as a Black man, I have experienced so many different things, both externally, internally, imposter syndrome, being in places that were not designed by me. I've taught in PWIs for most of I've been a teacher for 23 years. It's been a while, but I started off working in schools that were underserved. Most of the students had no connection to the arts whatsoever, and I was expected to, as an art teacher and an artist, expose them, give them a full exposure to it. And for me, the real connection was not just in what I could teach them, it was what I could show them. And so as I kind of developed as a teacher over the years, my work has expanded, not just through what I'm doing as an artist, but I like to try to give, I believe in mentorship. I believe in multi-generational conversations, because that's how we pass down wisdom and history and knowledge. But the other side of it is that people have to be exposed to the work. And so to your question about the different voices that I use, I do public sculptures and work, but the projects that I choose, I try to make sure that they are of some value to the community, no matter what the project is. It could be a sculpture. I have a sculpture in a park that pretty much couldn't get too political or controversial with it, but instead I chose that opportunity to talk about my own story with my father and the multi-generational conversations that I was having to my ancestors through my mom, my father, and my grandparents, which I think is a story that everyone can relate to. I usually try to implement symbolism that people can look at and see themselves in, both literally and figuratively. In these pieces, I hope that, even though these things, sometimes you have to study them and really look at them, and you may not get a firm understanding of where it came from, you can see yourself in the work in some way. I had someone come up to me last night and said that one of the pieces drove them to tears, and I was like actually really amazed that that emotion was there in the work for them to find. But that also is a huge compliment, not only to me, but to the privilege that I have to be able to wield my hands and do what I do as an artist. I hope that answered your question, or maybe touched on your question. Yeah. Brad, how am I doing on time? Is it time for me to get down? Okay. All right. Well, I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you all. And I'll be around today if you have any questions about the work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really special to have art as part of our worship space. That is a spirit-filled movement that we don't engage in very much. So thank you. Thank you. And with that, let's go in peace, bearing intergalactic seeds of liberation. Amen.